I think we're now ready for the Q&A session, and it'll take place in the usual way. Are the mics there?
They are.
Oh, they are, yes. And so put up your hands if you have a question. I'm sure a lot of hands will be going up. So I'll take the first one.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 14. The citizens at this table had two questions to put to Professor O'Shea, and also just make one observation. The first question, Professor O'Shea, is do you believe that we are getting value for money in the way that money is being spent at the moment, and that is the money going to the right place? And there's an attached statement to that, is that more funding is required, is the view of the citizens at this table. The second question is, are you aware the Centre for Economic and Social Research on Dementia, is there any evidence that people are now presenting with dementia at an earlier age? And if there is evidence of that, then that obviously would have implications for funding. Thank you.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
Okay.
So, no, the mic.
Yeah, so, okay. So the first question was value for money. Well, value for money is always an interesting question. I suppose, listen to Anthony Thinker yesterday, she mentioned a few times about, the fact that evaluations weren't done, haven't been done, and so on like that. We're a little behind, I guess, on the evaluation of a lot of what we do. The question for value for money is a question, again, going back to, well, value for money for what? If you see the primary objective for 30 years is keeping older people at home, well, you have to wonder then the question in terms of we're still not close to that target. The value for money question is an economic efficiency question. It's an economic equity question. So in terms of value for money, I think for example, the people who are providing care, it's my experience that those people are providing care at a really high level, huge commitment. Simply there's not enough people available to provide the care that we need in terms of community-based care. And in terms of value for money, for example, the outcome measures that we might want to use, for example, going back to quality of life outcome issues. What are the targets in terms of the value for money that you want to talk about? Is it autonomy? Is it connectivity? Is it engagement? If these are the outcomes, I would say in terms of value for money, we have a little bit to go in terms of reaching those sort of outcomes. And the second question then in terms of early onset dementia, well, early onset dementia has particular issues. If people get dementia in their 50s, there are different sets of circumstances, structures, for example, that need to be accounted for. I'm not sure whether people are presenting earlier, it's getting maybe picked up. There are now more memory clinics around. There's more knowledge about dementia, and it's a good thing that people have timely diagnosis because it allows them to plan, particularly if it's early onset dementia. But this is an area, for example, where we need to know a lot more about in terms of the numbers and the sort of post-diagnostic supports available and sort of the trajectory of care.
Could I just ask, who do you think should be responsible for accumulating that information on dementia?
Well, as said in the presentation, information is a key issue. There's certainly as part of the National Dementia Strategy, Trojan work now being done in terms of the Understand Together campaign of the HSE, which is trying to put out information on dementia. But we need sort of care coordination within the HSE structures in terms of sort of link workers, which allow our connectors in some way, which allow people to get information, figure out what they want on foot of that information, and then set about trying to provide that. It doesn't always have to be provided by the state or by the HSE. There's a whole sort of psychosocial world, a social world, which doesn't necessarily mean that we have to medicalise issues. But when we do have to medicalise dementia, we do need then to have people that are able to access the specialist care that they need. as well. So I think it's necessary to have somebody who knows what's going on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 3. And there was concern raised at this table as to the vast input of care provided for by families and how, in many ways, that's not overly quantifiable. And they would like me to ask how you feel about people without family and how you feel about people without a safety net, and how do funding models deal with that? The second question is to do with life social insurance and other countries. They would like to know if you could expand on other countries and how they track their funding and spending in terms of transparency and where citizens see their money being spent.
Okay. So again, it goes back to the question about families and the engagement of families. So we know, certainly from survey work and from the CSO, that families are providing a lot of care. Not everybody has a carer, and that's why we have a public system. That's why we have a system of care to pick up the sort of care needs and of people like that. So we do need to have. It's not a safety net. We do need to have a properly functioning public system of care, which is able to provide care if people don't have family care, and even if they have family care, to provide care that fits in a complementary way, that complements family care, and that allows people to in a sense, to have some sort of co-production or mutuality in respect of family care. So that to me is a sort of a normal, properly functioning public system of care for older people. The second question. So it's difficult to answer because, I don't have the detail of every system's particularly the social insurance system of long-term care. So, for example, in Germany, there are 4 or 5 different levels of care that people get resources for, including, being able to fund family members to provide care. The regulatory system is, the tracking system, the monitoring system. One of the things that social insurance system allows to do, for example, you can still have private production, but it's publicly financed, and you can have competition as well in order to keep costs down. So you have the payers at one side and the providers at the other. So there are many different models where you can provide care, and as I said earlier, there's also cost sharing, and these cost sharing issues are equally problematic in those social insurance countries as well. So slightly differently, with slightly different emphasis on the role of the family, for example. In Germany, there's a strong, explicit commitment, subsidiarity-based, that the families are important. That commitment, or that explicit commitment, would be slightly different in Holland, in the Netherlands, that there wouldn't be as strong a public commitment to family. So you got these, you have these differences in terms of commitment, and all countries are struggling. All countries are struggling here to think about payment for long-term care. This is not there is not a utopia out there where we can, where some country has got this solved. Everybody is struggling with the numbers in terms of that commitment to care. So.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. Yes.
I'm the facilitator for Table 4, and I have 2 questions from the citizens for Professor O'Shea. The first, I know you've just kind of touched on it there, but you referred to the German model of family care and the responsibility as being explicit. And the members at this table were wondering, could you explain that in more detail and how it works?
Is that it? Yeah, okay. Well, so it's a little difficult to think about the explicitness and the subsidiarity would be a central tenet of the sort of social protection system, that subsidiarity meaning that care is provided at the level that's most appropriate, whether that's at a family level, a commune level, a community level, a regional level, a federal level. There's a strong sort of ethos within the welfare state system. So there are also other countries, for example, if you look at the north-south divide in terms of long-stay care, I mentioned Greece, for example, but to some extent Spain as well, sort of the Latin Rim countries would have a particular view of family responsibility. But that view of family responsibility wouldn't have the German complementarity or mutuality element built in to support that. It would simply be saying that families should be cared for at home. It's not the state's responsibility. We have nothing to do with this. Whereas the German system would be more explicit in its terms of, yeah, we believe families are important, but we also believe that families, and you have to pay for this, or a social insurance system to pay for this, but we also believe the state should be directly involved in supporting that. So it's partly cultural, partly constitutional, partly economic. All of these elements come in to sort of determining what's the optimal level. And it's a case, I guess, in this country then, wondering, families have always had a key, older people within families and older people within families historically have always had a special place in families, and particularly when the economy was more agrarian, where it was more agricultural, where older people had special rights, special position. And if you look back, we always pride ourselves in one sense in saying, families are really important, the family unity is really important. But at the same time, there's elements of paradox here. Our system was highly institutionalized early on, as well, mainly for people without families, I guess. But, there is this element of what families should and should not do. I think we take it for granted at one level. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think we should have a system where we are quite explicit that either we think families are important and should take the whole burden of care, or we think families are so important that we support them in everything they do, or we think that the state should take over care and that families should have a minor responsibility. These are sort of questions that I think would benefit from a more explicit discussion, in my view, rather than have an implicit, which it is at the moment, where families are bearing a really high burden. But as I said, there are significant benefits from caring, that coming back from reciprocity, intergenerational support, all of the things that we take for granted in our own lives, and we think about this. But, I think choice is important. Families are different. There's no one generic family, out there. So therefore, there's going to be differences. And where care isn't available, we must have a strong public system of care, in my view.
There was a second question, I think.
There was, thank you.
Table 4.
And the second question is, it was the view of the citizens that, in terms of your own presentation and that of the panel of experts yesterday, that it shows that there has been extensive research of a high qualitative and quantitative nature over many, many years, coming up with some really good solution-based ideas for progression of the subject, but everybody comes up with the same end piece, that there just are not the resources there to bring it on to the next stage. The citizens here are wondering, what do you feel needs to happen to bring this on to the next stage? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think I certainly think in the last number of years, hard to put a number on this, there's been a lot more engagement directly with issues like this, whether it comes from sort of recognizing the importance of age. The longitudinal study on aging was really important in sort of allowing us to think as a society about aging. There's lots more information now coming out from that survey, for example. There's lots more people interested in research on aging. There certainly is a stronger socio-political engagement stemming from maybe about 10 years ago. There was, if you remember, large protests a number of years ago, which kind of made explicit that older people had views, and they were anxious to express those views. I think that was important. I think there is a stronger sense in politics as well. We have a minister for older people as well at the moment, which is pushing in, and for a number of years, people trying to push in the same direction. I just think we need to accelerate this much faster. And we do, in my view, need to get some more resources available to support community-based care. We need to be quicker in moving in changing our philosophy of care to one based on a sort of a direct involvement and engaging. That's beginning to happen as well with more sort of PPI, public patient involvement in decision making everywhere. So there are lots of reasons to be optimistic, while acknowledging the correct point you made, that there's this element of frustration that we haven't managed to accelerate this. But there are certainly a lot of really good thinking, good data, and engagement in this process, and strong advocacy in this process now that perhaps took us a while to develop.
That's interesting. Yes.
I'm the facilitator for Table 6, and I ask these questions on behalf of the citizens of the table. Firstly, is it possible to have a system like in the UK where employers pay into a compulsory pension scheme? And secondly, in relation to a social insurance system, if this was put in place, would legislation be needed in order to protect the use of funding? And also, would 1% of taxation be enough to cover a social insurance system and have money left over for a contingency? So there is one further point. A member of the table has asked me to state the work of the Retirement Planning Council, and they've stated that they think these services should be offered for free to all members of society.
So there was a lot of questions there.
Yeah.
So I don't have a theory of everything to solve. So one of the things that you mentioned there, I'm not aware that, I mean Britain's spending on ageing is just below the OECD average at about 1.2%. So, and I'm not aware of the insurance mechanism going into long-term care funding. They don't have a social insurance system, and you saw the difficulties they got into when in the recent election, when they started trying to meddle with social care, poorly thought out meddling with social care with regard to dementia tax. The second part of your question, just come back to me. Sorry. So
the second part of the social insurance question was, would 1% of taxation be enough to cover?
So it really does almost, how long is a piece of string? What do you want to happen here? I mean, we do need to get serious if we're thinking about this in terms of getting actuarially analysis as to what would constitute or what monies would be generated through various changes in a social insurance tax. I'm not sure. I gave a figure that Mercer did in 2002, which would bring about 0.6 billion. Now, 0.6 billion would be welcome. Is it enough? That's a question that I would sort of go back to my presentation and say, well, what do you want to happen? What sort of home care system do you want? What sort of acute care system do you want with respect to sort of provision of kind of social elements of care, the relationship between acute care and primary care and secondary care? It really does depend on what you view the system is. If you want more personalised care, if you want personnel to be important in care, if you want an equal system of care, if you want no cost sharing, your rates, that's not going to cover what you need. So it really depends on what sort of parameters you put, and then you use government, the levers of government, to say, we're going to have to do this. In terms of monitoring and regulating the system of care, there has to be regulation. You would expect in the social insurance system you'd like some competition in provision to keep costs down. Yeah, so we'd have a sole funder who'd have some sort of monopoly power to sort of control, to look at competition in provision. So you could build in all sorts of things to try to keep costs down, because costs will keep going up, numbers will keep going up. This is not a static problem. This is not something that's 2017 that's static. The numbers are static. The numbers are dynamic. The numbers are changing. You heard the figures on dementia yesterday. These are going up. Now, as well as, of course, economic growth isn't static either. So we're going to become richer, hopefully. but economic growth is probably going to keep going. and so we won't be static either in terms of our ability to fund these issues. Income per capita is probably likely to be going up. So new resources will find their way into markets, and new markets will develop. You can't trap a system in time and say, oh yeah, we got it right there. The system is incredibly dynamic in terms of numbers, costs, competition, and potential demands on the system, and then we have to regulate for that, regulate really well for that. So, for example, a home care system that we're thinking of developing and having a statute based to that, we really are going to have to pay a lot of attention to regulation here, which is not going to be easy and is not going to be cheap. And so these are considerations that also, when we think about sitting down to sort of think about a system of care, yeah, there are implications in terms of regulation and outcomes for what we want.
Yeah, I mean, home care would definitely have to have a statutory basis, and obviously that is recognised now that there is consideration of a bill in the Department of Health. Any other question?
I am the facilitator for Table 13. The members of the table have 3 related questions, and there's a comment as well. Why has home care never been prioritised to date? Why has the situation continued for so long? Why has the proportional spend per person dropped? And the comment is that there should be a greater focus on public education around these issues.
Okay, so home care tends not to be as visible. It tends to be more invisible. It tends to be, and maybe not as well organised as a sort of a residential care system. If we're coming into any town and we see the residential care building, it's very part of the system. It drives employment in a town. And it's a part of a functioning social and economic system within a town, within a city. So it's easier in a sense to I use the term misplaced community care within that system because it's by its nature, it's individual, it's specific, it's somebody going into a person's home. They arrive, they leave. There's not a strong advocacy around it. And I think that's part of the reason. And part of the reason is, I guess, an implicit view, and this is what I come back to, that maybe among our funders, that maybe families should be doing this. And that why would we intervene if we believe that families should be doing this and aren't they doing it for free anyway? So there's interesting subplots going on here. Some are to do with economics, some are to do with social aspects, and some are to do with advocacy, and some are to do with decisions taken. We took a decision, for example, to provide tax breaks for nursing homes, which meant more nursing homes are built. If more nursing homes are there, there's an almost iron law that if the beds are there, they'll be filled. So these are partly the reasons why a home care system has not. It's not for the want of an acknowledgement that this is important, but we simply haven't managed to do it. The second question, the numbers are going down. Simply, there was, austerity happened. It's a fact of life for all of us. It meant that, as I said in the presentation, when cuts came, they tend to come at the weakest. They came at the weakest point. The weakest point was obviously the kind of fragmented community care system that wasn't statutory based. As the numbers, they came at the same time as numbers of older people generally were increasing, and that's what you saw in that. Yeah. Numbers going up, funding going slightly down, per capita spending going down. It'll come back up again if we spend more. And again, I'm not saying what's the right level of funding there. It's simply just saying, look, you just need to watch this all the time. And the information systems we have, for example, as I said, one of the great things the last number of years has been Tilda, but in terms of the public system, public information system, it's getting better in terms of expenditure, in terms of knowing what's been spent, in terms of breakdowns, but we needed much more specific to sort of policy questions we want to address. We're collecting data at the moment that we don't need, and we're not collecting data that we do need. And we do need specific data on mix of spending, what we're spending it on. But we also need to open up potential for areas that we haven't thought about in spending, where sometimes in the psychosocial area, sometimes in the social area, and we need to create budget heads for that and budget items for that. And we need to present information to each other about what's going on, because there's lots of people around the country who are doing incredible work. I mean, absolutely incredible work in areas and voluntary work, creating little pockets of support based on really strong philosophical view that older people are important, that older people should be engaged in society. There are people doing incredible work, and we don't know what's going on. We haven't evaluated what's working and what's not working. We often replicate, and if we knew what was going on, we wouldn't replicate. And when we do need to replicate, we don't know enough of the good things that are going on. But there is a mobilisation. There is a strong element of community engagement here all around the country. I would just want more of it in terms of support for older people.
Good morning. I'm the facilitator at table number 2. The citizens at this table have 3 themed questions. The first theme, which is a number of sub-questions, concerns the social insurance model, and specifically, what are the pros and cons of this model versus the general taxation model? How would it work? What would the required cost or level of this be to meet residential care, community-based care, and home-based care? And how would this affect the competitiveness and the labour market? So that's the first theme, and I can just, the 2 other questions are shorter. I can ask you. And the second question is, are there other reasons outside of funding why we have not been able to deliver the desired care? And the third question that citizens have asked me to ask is, do you think that it would be an option to approach religious orders to provide resources funding for the care of the elderly?
So the engagement with the social insurance model, as I said, one of the things that it does, it creates a reciprocal, intergenerational certainty, transparency, a budget pool which we know is fixed for long-term care, and we can then track the relationships and the spending. We can see what we're spending it on. If we want to increase it, we can increase it, and so on. It's very much more transparent. You don't have to be trying to tease your way through spending and say, well, what spending comes there? We know we have a budget, because nobody will tell you how much budget we have available. In terms of the competitiveness question, I don't know the answer to that question, because going back to earlier, if we have, for example, if we say, well, Germany is just under 2%. If we say we needed a 2% levy or something like that, it depends on what you want to spend it on. A 2% levy, I don't have the actuarial data which allows me to say that generates an extra billion on social insurance. But we need to figure out that in terms of competitiveness. It then depends on your view of the labour market. How would that affect the labour market? It would obviously have some effect on the labour market. It would increase labour costs, which would, by its nature, impact on competitiveness. There's no doubt it would impact on decision making, and would be probably unpopular in some senses in terms of labour market. But it depends on how you view this from a societal point of view, which goes back to my question. If you engage this in a way that determines the relationship between the economy and society, the relations between the economic and the social, these sort of questions that are fundamental to sort of making decisions about what type of world we live in this country, then you get a very different perspective. So you acknowledge that this impacts on competitiveness, and if it's too impacting on competitiveness, we can't do this. This is not possible. We don't have a consensus that this is possible. We have to fund through general taxation. I could see that argument.
Can I just ask you one thing, Eamon? Obviously, it would be the Department of Social Protection that would be involved in this, and we know that they have advisory bodies.
Yeah.
Has this ever been considered by the Department of Social Protection? Do you know?
So it was considered. It was considered back in 2002, The report might not have come out in 2004, I can't remember. It was
Was
done by Mercer.
Yeah.
Mercer did a large piece on principles of funding alongside care. They came down in favour of social insurance, certainly supporting social insurance, but acknowledged that it would have costs.
Yeah.
There was a subsequent interdepartmental committee which were, I think in 2006, which were, certainly engaged with the issue of social insurance, and I'm not, but eventually sort of came down on some sort of cost-sharing co-payment mechanism that we ended up with, but only for residential care, which subsequently became the NHSS. Now, I'm not sure there's a linear relationship here. I'm not linking I'm not linking the three of them.
Yeah.
But that's part of a chronological account.
Yeah.
There was a discussion on the nursing home scheme. There was a discussion on insurance. They did make these calculations and they're in that report. But the rates were different then, so we can't just extrapolate.
Yeah.
And there was an interdepartmental discussion. There was a certain degree of support for social insurance, but it didn't subsequently find its way into the sort of legislation and the NHS or Fair Deal scheme. That's the kind of line.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry, I didn't answer your...
The two other questions were, and thanks very much, are there other resources outside of...
Can I interrupt there? I don't really see the relevance of the third question, quite frankly. So I think we'll skip that one.
And the second question is, are there other reasons outside of funding why we have not been able to deliver the desired care?
Well, partly is, there are always organisational issues, there are always systems issues, but in fairness to the HSE and in terms of what the work that's going on now, there's a huge commitment, I would say, and in terms of, say, social care, to try to move the system towards a more person-centred care structure. And I think there was certainly organisational elements and silo elements of, particularly if you want to integrate health and social, clinical and social, clinical and psychosocial. These are all important kind of meeting points. And it's difficult because you have a system built on, section there, administrative structure there. But I would say that we're beginning to sort of open up a little bit in terms of that engagement and the need to sort of integrate the sort of the social, the clinical, psychosocial.
Thank you. Yes.
Judge, I'm the facilitator for table number 5, and the citizens would like to ask the following questions of the Professor. First question, what does the Professor think of a government incentivised savings scheme similar to the SSIA scheme to encourage people to fund their own healthcare needs? Second question, how could you broaden the base from which the social insurance type deduction will be made to relieve burden solely on the working population? My next question, given that the Netherlands have implemented a social insurance scheme that provides a care system that costs over 4% of GDP, how do the Netherlands protect themselves against net inward migration of people over 65 from other EU states intending to avail of these services? And my last question, according to Mercer, 0.7 billion will be generated by 1% social insurance levy. The HSE budget is 1.9 billion today, though the population of 65-year-olds will increase by 250,000 in the next 10 years. How much social insurance do we really need to pay to fund care at this level?
So,
Well, somebody very good at sums at table 5.
yeah, so these are, if you start off with a view that you need to get more funding, there's obviously going to be policy options available. Whether an SSI scheme is the most efficient way of funding long-term care, I'd have my doubts, because it would have unintended consequences, and it'd also be very directive in terms of people's saving behaviour. I mean, you could argue equally. You could say, look, you could say to people, we're not going to spend anything on long-term care. We're not going to spend anything on long-term care. Start saving. It's an equally valid policy thing as citizens to say, yeah, long-term care, it's going to happen for some of us. Yeah, start saving. And in fact, some people do. Some people do. Private saving is used to, a significant amount of people are still able to pay out of pocket for retirement and for retirement risks. And that's what people do. So I don't know the answer specifically to that question, but I do know you need to be careful about using schemes, for one purpose and having unintended consequences the next. But it is an issue about how much we're expected to save, how much is our own responsibility, and how much co-responsibilities governments have. As I said, it's a pretty identifiable risk, older age. And dependency within that is a pretty identifiable risk. So, but as I said, private insurance markets don't take off because we don't believe this, actually. We don't believe we're going to get older, and we certainly don't want to be paying insurance for it in our 20s when we just started work. So there would be a big job, and we have if you look at the difficulty, for example, of getting people to take out occupational pensions, and that's a big task in getting people to take out pensions. So you can imagine the task of getting people to take out private insurance or engage in those sort of schemes. So broadening the base, well, that's a policy question. I mean, you could have, there's nothing to stop us having a once-off tax to fund a once-off tax on anything, to augment, to set in place a certain scheme. But it has implications if you start taxing people, if you start taxing property, if you start taxing assets, and we saw, for example, in the Fair Deal scheme, the need, for example, to modify that scheme because of difficulties that farmers are having, because their assets were included, their farm assets were included in the Fair Deal scheme, which caused interesting behavioural issues and interesting issues about farms and transfer of land, which had to be dealt with because of the excessive cost sharing that was involved there, for example. So hopefully that's likely, hopefully, to be resolved shortly. But again, it has consequences if we start implementing this. And there's sort of I presume that, and again, I don't know this for sure, but I presume the Dutch system, there would be that if it's a contributory system, you would have to have paid into the system in order to get those long-term care benefits later on. So you'd have had to have paid a social insurance contribution in order to benefit from that system. And the last question, the last question was the contribution. So that was a 1% contribution, both employees and employers, generating that 0.7 billion. Again, I keep going back to, what you think you want to fund and the implications of that then for the labour market. I know it's not maybe an answer that's terribly helpful, but it's an answer nevertheless that I have to give. Until you do the sums on this, you won't know what it will mean for the labour market and for people for employees until you decide what you want to spend it on. Yeah. And if we want to put it only in home care, it's going to be less. So, for example, do we have a home care insurance? Sorry, do we have an insurance market, a social insurance for home care only, or do we have a social insurance for both home care and residential care? Do we have a social insurance mechanism that takes into account social provision? Do we have a social insurance mechanism that takes into account some part payment for carers? Do we have a social insurance system that includes co-payments? So all of those is going to determine the level and the amount of money generated.
Thank you very much. It's a colossal issue, isn't it?
Yes.
It's colossal. I'm going to take one more question.
Thank you very much. Name is Dermot Flynn on table 7. It's a simple enough question in its way. You mentioned earlier a split of 80-20 that reversed to 20-80 public-private. Yeah. Just what pot of money is that? And and then was the pot bigger when the private sector came into it, the private money came into it? Yeah. And was therefore I just don't understand what the money is, where it's from. Yeah. Also, you've posed a lot of questions, rightly so, about what society we want, but somebody is making decisions at the moment. We have a social welfare system, we have a home care system, we have Fair Deal. People are making decisions. Maybe a question for the convention. I'd like to hear from that person who makes those decisions and defend why they made them. they would be difficult to defend because we all have different opinions. But it's a lot of our, in my view, a lot of what we've heard has been about analysis, about a hopeful future, and about reports and summaries and an academic exercise. But for me, what's happening on the ground, how we've got here, I think I'd be interested in hearing it. Thank you.
Just to clarify the 80-20, so the point I was making there, and apologies for maybe some confusion on it, the 80-20% was, we used to, this is related to beds only, so residential beds, long-term care residential beds, it used to be we had 80% of our beds were public and 20% were private. You can imagine, remember the original county homes, there was a very small development of private nursing home beds up to the 80s, and that then became accelerated in the 90s. There was favourable tax breaks for building nursing home beds, and we've ended up with this, and there was also a lot of the public beds were seen to be not suitable. Some of those buildings were certainly not suitable for person-centred care. So we've had a sort of a running down of the public stock and a building up of the private stock. So there's, and it's now roughly 80-20 private public beds. So does it have implications? It has implications in the sense of we've changed the structure of care. I'm not, you know, it's certainly the quality of care in the majority, vast majority of nursing homes, particularly through the regulation of HICWA, and now because HICWA can regulate public care, similarly with public care, you know, there's been a lot of work done on quality, on assuring quality. I would like a lot more work done on getting the sort of personhood element, the sort of the how do I phrase it? The sort of humanity of care. It's difficult to regulate for that sort of engagement, but nevertheless, I think that we still have a little bit to go on that. But you know, in general, you know, in terms of care is of good quality. But you know, there are issues to do about, you know, the mix of care within public and private, and the level of relationship between the private care system and the community care system, and with the acute care system. So there's issues there which would take us a long time to go through. But that's all I was talking about in terms of the sort of the shift, in terms of, in a sense, it's what financing is what matters. You know, we need to regulate production to make sure it's of first-rate quality, and that requires funding. So I would concentrate a little bit more on the funding than on the production.
Very good. We've had an absolutely amazing 2 hours, haven't we? And will you express your gratitude to Eamon? Thank him very much. Eamon deserves his cup of coffee, and all of you deserve your cup of coffee. So we'll recommence. It was to be 11:45. I'll say 11:50. Yeah. We will for the roundtable discussion, and that'll be in private as well.